All right, we are here. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's presentation of Return of the Natives. We're going to be talking about the rewilding of North America, and I'll explain what a lot of that means. Now, tonight's class will be taught by myself, Daryl Radijak. We were going to have Stephanie Payne join us as well. She is an apex predator specialist out of East Tennessee. She's in the Smokies, but she contacted us and let us know that her internet service is down due to weather conditions. And so I'll be filling in for Stephanie. She will be joining me on Sunday as well for the cougar presentation since she knows cougars so well. So anyway, tonight's presentation is going to be a good one. It's like I said, Return of the Natives. It's the rewilding of North America. And the way I like to kick off all of these presentations is to assure everyone in the audience that the information they're receiving in these webinars is good stuff. We're not just reading stuff. It's not just someone who just read information off the internet and is passing it along. All the instructors for Wildlife for You are diehard career wildlife biologists who have been not just studying these animals, but working with these animals. So most of you know my history. I did receive my degree in wildlife management from the College of Environmental Science and Forestry way back in 1992. One of the first jobs I took was working at the Appalachian Bear Center. Did that for about 5 years. That's where my love for these large carnivores and other really, really cool animals developed. Then I started working for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. I was the big game coordinator, and so I was responsible for all the black bears in the state, all the white-tailed deer, elk, feral hogs. And then after a while, I was promoted to the chief of wildlife for the state of Tennessee. I was literally over all animals in the state of Tennessee. That was a great job, but it involved a lot of dressing up in suits and talking to commissioners and got me out of the field. So I jumped ship, headed west to fulfill a lifelong dream of mine, and I've been here for like the last 4 years. So been working with wildlife for about 23 years, just over 23 years. Education is a huge part of what I do. Not only do I manage wildlife, but teaching others about wildlife is truly my passion, and that's why I'm here today. Now, I won't spend a lot of time. Stephanie was supposed to join us tonight, but she has the internet issues. She also has a degree in wildlife management. She's got a cool degree, much better than mine. The Human Wildlife Dynamics. Oregon State University is a fantastic wildlife school. The cool thing, she's got one of the coolest jobs. She coordinates these wildlife human attack response trainings. And so she works with state, provincial, federal governments to train their law enforcement personnel and other wildlife biologists about responding to wildlife attacks. So she's got a really cool niche there in the world of wildlife. So we were going to talk to you today. But it'll be me filling in mostly since Stephanie is having those internet issues. So let's get underway and figure out what the heck we're exactly talking about in today's presentation. And so the title alone has a couple of things that I want to make sure we understand. We define them so everyone's on the same page when we're talking about this topic. And so we're going to go over a couple of definitions to start things out. So first and foremost, return of the natives. What does it mean when I say an animal is a native animal? Now leave it to scientists, biologists, whatever you call, when you're trying to define a word, it probably doesn't work too well when you use another word that oftentimes needs definition. So if you look it up, it'll say of indigenous origins. And so unless you know what indigenous means, it's hard to understand, but it's a really simple thing. I'm sure everyone on this presentation knows what native is. It's literally an animal that was historically found in an area. It was born in that area. It evolved in that area. Those are what we're going to consider native animals. Now, another key point of this is that animal was not brought to its location by man. And so the fact that I say an animal was born in an area, if it was brought in by man, it's not considered a native animal. And so let's just start talking or looking at potential native animals in North America. And so some of these are really simple. You all know that's an American black bear. We all know this is a native animal. These have always been found in North America. Obviously, this is, I was going to quiz you, but I imagine most will get it right. This is not a buffalo. This is a bison. I don't have too much of a hang up, but I do know some wildlife instructors go crazy when they hear people call this animal a buffalo. It's actually a bison. A buffalo is those Cape buffalo in Africa. But everyone knows these are native animals. Obviously, when the Europeans first came over, these roamed all over the Great Plains in literally uncountable numbers, numbering in the tens of millions. So that's a native animal. Obviously, some of these deer species, such as elk, are also native to North America. How about this? These wild mustangs in the West, are these native animals? Yes or no? Nope, very good. Now, it's kind of interesting. Believe it or not, there were horses in North America during the Pleistocene, so tens of thousands of years ago. We had horses in North America, but they died out in the Pleistocene. And so the horses that we have here now are the European horses that were brought over when the Spanish and the Europeans, they actually came first with the Spanish. But horses, or these wild mustangs, are not native. It's actually quite a controversial topic because the numbers of horses in the West now, and with them not being a native animal, they can cause quite a bit of issues. Brown bears. Obviously, we know these are native to North America. What about these things? These wild hogs. Obviously, everyone knows that these hogs are not native to North America. Again, these came over when the Spanish brought them for food items. This is going to be one of the biggest issues with wildlife in the next coming decades because they started out pretty much in Florida and they've literally spread across North America. Tremendously damaging to the environment. We don't want these animals rewilding or spreading across the continent because they are not native animals. And obviously cougars. Now we are going to be talking specifically about apex predators in this class. And here we have a gray wolf. So here's the next question. Is this animal native to North America? We know they have a tremendous impact. The thing is, with humans, yes, humans are native to North America. They came over approximately, and obviously the ages vary, but about 15,000 years ago, some of the latest, or the earliest known peoples were here in North America about between 13 to 15,000 years ago. Yep, they came over that land bridge. And so humans, we can say, are native to North America. What I loved about this, because I wanted to show a picture of a Native American, and this was one of the first pictures that popped up, because I was showing the Native American being native to North America, yet he is sitting on top of a non-native animal. So there's a long history of what's native, what's not native. The thing that we care about most in the world of wildlife and in ecosystems are these native animals. They have evolved on that landscape, and they have adapted to living on that landscape. And so we're going to be focusing on three primary native animals that are more or less rewilding North America. The only reason I put this picture up here, I did teach a class earlier today about Wile E. Coyote. And the thing that's interesting is you hear a lot of people talk about coyote, especially on the East Coast. They'll say that coyotes are not native. And it's true and it's false. They're native to North America, but they are not. Literally before 1700, coyotes were pretty much only found in the Midwest and in the Southwest. And just within the last couple centuries, they expanded their range and now dominate all of North America. They are a native animal to the continent. They can be considered invasive. I won't go into that, but they're kind of a new species that's expanding their range, but they are native species to North America. So whenever we're talking about native animals or A couple other things. We always have to be mindful of scale because, like I said, with this coyote, it's not native to like the East Coast, but it is native to North America. So whenever you're having this discussion, you kind of have to figure out scale first before you can answer something appropriately. So I'm going to mention something that many people know is one of my least favorite topics, subspecies. I don't mind talking about it. The reason I talk about it is because it's often misunderstood. And so when we're dealing with subspecies, let's look at this graphic here. I don't know how well you can see it, but there's about 6 little geographic regions highlighted throughout all of North America. And you see Canadensis, Manitobensis, Nelsoni, Merriam, Yosemite, and what's the last one? Roosevelt. Does anyone know what species we're looking at there? Those 6 groupings, very, very good, Shirley. Those 6 groupings are all elk. I showed you a picture. In fact, I'll show it again. Those 6 groupings are all elk. The thing is, a lot of times people will talk about subspecies as if they're completely different species, and they're not. So Canadensis on the far east was an elk that lived in the eastern half of North America. The Nelsoni, those lived in the Rocky Mountains. An elk is an elk is an elk. So you pull an elk out of the Rocky Mountains, you put it in the East Coast, it usually does just fine. Now, there will be subtle differences between them because they evolved in different geographic regions, but for the most part, they're the exact same animal. Oftentimes, people don't treat them as the same species. They're just from different geographic regions. And I guess the best way to explain this, or before I go to that, the reason I put this up is when we're going to be talking about wolves, you'll oftentimes hear a tremendous argument from some people to say, oh, the wolves that were reintroduced were not the same wolf. Yes, they're the same wolf. It was a different subspecies, but it's still a gray wolf that was introduced. And so if someone argues that they didn't use the correct subspecies for the reintroduction of the wolf, you have to understand when we reintroduced elk and deer and even turkey and a lot of these other charismatic animals, we released different subspecies all over North America. So it's very hypocritical to say you can't do it with the wolf, but it's okay to do it with an elk or a deer or something else like that. So I always point that out when we get into the argument. Whenever they're saying the subspecies is not the same, it doesn't matter. They're still the exact same species. Best way to describe that picture there, we are all humans. But humans coming from different parts of the country, different continents, we all look different. And if you get an argument today about humans being different races, we all know that we're all one human race. So that subspecies argument kind of flies out the window. So I like talking about it because I like clearing up the misconceptions that some people have. All right, that was enough about native animals and what we're going to be talking about. And the other word I kind of want to just make sure you're clear about is this rewilding. What do we mean about rewilding? And so if you look it up, it's pretty simple. Rewilding is simply the return of wild animals to an area where they once belonged or where they were driven out. So there's animals in a location and then they were no longer there. Rewilding is just bringing those animals back. But there's 2 really important concepts to this rewilding aspect. So we're going to look at an example here of a wildlife population. I'm not saying this is any particular, I drew this in, so I just made this up. So pretend this is species X. And this is the historic range. And generally when we're talking about historic range, it's usually pre-European settlement. And so we'll look, say, 300, 400 years ago. This red area is where these animals used to live. Now, what were Europeans, the modern Europeans, really, really good at? Very well, Helen, you you answered it kind of right away. we were really good. The Eastern Europeans were really good at killing things off. Now, I'm not saying it is a bad thing, but it's not. It's understandable. This picture here, if you can't see it too well, you know what they're standing on are bison skulls. And so that just goes to show the mass slaughter of wildlife that occurred in North America. And like I said, it was a bad thing, but you have to understand it was the way of life a couple hundred years ago. There was market hunting. They were trying to feed families, trying to feed cities, and so they just saw this wildlife as a commodity to use as a resource to feed other humans. And so they were really good at killing things off. So what happened with a lot of species all throughout North America is this fancy word called extirpation. Now keep an eye on North America there, because I'll show you what extirpation means. So we start killing off animals. Their range shrinks dramatically. They're no longer found in a lot of places they used to be. So in fact, I'll go back. If you are living in Colorado, New Mexico, and all of a sudden all the animals are killed out, those animals are extirpated from where you used to live. Now, I'm not using the term extinct, because extinct literally means they're gone from the face of the earth. A lot of people will describe extirpation as a local extinction. I kind of understand that, but extinction is usually reserved for the animal no longer exists on Earth. So, here's what happened. Great people, Aldo Leopold, Gifford Pinchot, Teddy Roosevelt. About the 19th, it would be the 20th century, so early 1900s, some really smart, wonderful individuals looked out across the landscape and said, there is something bad wrong here. We are killing all the wildlife across North America. And in fact, one of the coolest things I remember commenting on, Aldo Leopold did a lot of his works around New Mexico. New Mexico is gorgeous. It's one of the most beautiful states, unbeknownst to everyone except me. And we were doing a field trip with some students, and we were going to a lot of the places where Aldo Leopold worked. And someone had made a comment about, we were at his cabin that he built by hand, and someone made a comment that said, imagine how beautiful that place was and all the wild game he saw in 1900 as compared to today. And it was so striking to me, because it let me know that there's a lot of folks that don't understand where we've come from. Because when Aldo Leopold was doing his stuff and really starting this movement of wildlife conservation, there were no game animals. There was no longer elk in New Mexico. All the elk were completely wiped out. Bighorn sheep were on the drastic decline. You couldn't find bears. Most of the landscape was dominated by domestic animals, sheep, cattle. That's what Aldo Leopold was looking out over. And he said, there's something wrong. We got to start bringing back wildlife. And so through the works of him, like I said, Teddy Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, they started really making a case in Washington, D.C. that we've got to do something to restore wildlife populations across North America. And so that started beginning way back then in the early 1900s. There was no state wildlife agency. Wildlife were a commodity. If you had something on your land, you could kill it. And so we finally started forming these fish and game commissions to literally protect wildlife, to start bringing these populations back. And so there was lots of laws passed that would raise money for wildlife conservation, and things started improving. And here's kind of what happened. So keep an eye on the red dot that's in Ohio. I need a geography lesson. The red dot that's in Idaho. And so range expansion is the animals dwindled to a very small population. We started protecting them. We instituted game laws. We started enforcing game laws so people weren't killing animals indiscriminately. And we started seeing those animals rebound. And so if you watch that red dot, their range expanded. And that was a good thing. Wildlife were coming back. They were rewilding. They were coming back to areas where they were killed out from. The thing with that is when that happens and the animals expand on their own, it's very readily acceptable. The public loves it because it's like a hip hip hooray for the animals. They're coming back. Now, here's another thing that could happen. Wildlife agencies, again, they're entrusted to care for wildlife, and sometimes they want to bring animals back faster than range expansion will happen. And so if you keep your eye on the map, look around that West Texas area, and tell me what would happen here. How would a population like that suddenly pop up? That is literally when a wildlife agency would reintroduce. They would capture animals from one area and bring them back and reintroduce them into a new area. Typically, they would be reintroduced into the area that those animals once were. That is another fantastic form of rewilding. However, just understand that that form of reintroduction, of kind of forcing the animals back, if you look at within the general public, it's less readily acceptable. There is a psyche out there that says government, the whole Big Brother thing. And so when the government comes in and releases animals into a community against, not a lot of people are in favor of it, but some people are not. And when the government does it, it's great for wildlife, don't get me wrong, but oftentimes the public does not accept that wildlife as readily. I hope you can understand that. I know Melissa could probably understand that as well. And I'm going to talk about more about this in a little bit. So when we look, and I'll mention Melissa's situation in a little bit. When we look at which animals over the course of the last 3 or 4 centuries, which animals tended to be most persecuted? Would it be an animal like an elk that is seen as a food resource, or an animal like a predator that can diminish that food resource? Obviously, it's the predators that end up getting most of the persecution. The general public, again, hundreds of years ago, did not tolerate these predators well. So predators bore the brunt of this mass slaughter. Now, having said that, let me remind you and let me tell you that deer, turkeys, lots of other big animals were, I shouldn't say they were persecuted, but they were overhunted. And so a lot of animals were wiped out or extirpated from where they once belonged, but it was for 2 different reasons. The herbivores, like the deer, or the animals that we eat, they were killed out because we killed too many. We were eating too many of them, and so we killed them out that way. Predators, on the other hand, were killed out because they weren't wanted. They were viewed by the public as a nasty thing on the environment, almost like a nuisance. And so when you look at predators, which ones bore the brunt of this white man's movement? I would say brown bears. But it wasn't just brown bears. Understand that black bears were killed out from most of the range in the east. And so black bears pretty much only hung out in some of the most rural, most rugged mountain chains, and they only hung out there. So the Appalachian Mountains was like the last stronghold for black bears in many of the eastern states. But bears were ones that humans didn't readily tolerate. Obviously, cougars, another apex predator that were literally killed indiscriminately. You don't want to have a cougar wandering around if your family is living and walking through the forest. And then this guy, the gray wolf. Now, I'm going to quiz you guys. How many species of wolf are in North America? Does anyone know? I don't see anybody typing. Shirley, you're awesome. There are only 2 species of wolf. There is the gray wolf, often called the timber wolf, but technically it's called a gray wolf. And then this guy here is a red wolf. And so one is Canis lupus. The gray wolf is Canis lupus, and the red wolf is Canis rufus. And they have been, although genetics with canids gets really muddy really quick. But those are the two species of wolves. Now, again, when you hear all this wolf talk about what wolves were reintroduced and those weren't the same wolves, they are mostly convoluting this whole idea of subspecies. They're always talking about gray wolves, but they just came from different geographic areas. And like I said, it's pretty much a moot point because a wolf is a wolf is a wolf. So we're going to talk about primarily these three animals. So bears, cougars, and wolves. I hope that's okay with you guys. So let's start with brown bears. Ursus arctos. This is obviously one of my favorite animals. Obviously, bears are one of my favorite creatures. And if you've sat through any of my webinars that do talk about brown bears, I often have to clarify, well, what is it? I thought we had grizzlies. So I'm putting up two pictures. The two pictures on the right, the one at the top is a brown bear. The one in the bottom is a brown bear. All three pictures, they are all brown bears. But those two on the right look vastly different. So that one on the top is literally what we call an Alaskan brown bear. Oftentimes, if they come from Kodiak Island, they're called Kodiak bears. And so that subspecies is Middendorfii. Now you have to understand the reason that bear looks so hulky, so big, so intimidating is because they're huge. They'll grow to be 1,200 pounds because one of their main sources of food is those salmon runs. And so they're going to be gorging themselves on tremendously nutritious foods all throughout the summer and early fall. And so those bears will bulk up to be gigantic. Now the bear on the bottom right, the subspecies, or the geographic area, but the subspecies is horribilis, my favorite all-time subspecies. That is what we know as the grizzly bear. And so what a grizzly bear is simply a bear, a brown bear that lives in the interior of the continent, usually around the Rocky Mountains. And so Yellowstone, all through the Rockies, we call those grizzly bears. They're still brown bears, but they don't get as big as those coastal brown bears because if you look to see what grizzlies are mostly eating, they don't have the luxury of those giant salmon runs, and so they're eating berries, nuts, insects, scavenging. They don't have as much food resources as those Alaskan brown bears, and so they typically grow a lot smaller. But again, a brown bear is a brown bear is a brown bear. So these things once populated all of North America, but here's the cool thing about brown bears. A lot of people will be really worried about the status of brown bears, thinking that they're almost extinct. If you look at brown bears across the entire world, they're doing really well. They're found on all the continents in the northern hemisphere. So North America, Asia, Europe, they're found in many, many places. That we even have brown bears where that one student from Greece was. They have brown bears on the island of Greece. And so brown bears, obviously the stronghold is pretty much Russia. Lots and lots of amazing territory, but brown bears globally are doing really well. But look at that North America. We're going to take a closer look at the bears in North America. So when we look at the brown bear range, this is what it looked like when Christopher Columbus or when those first settlers arrived. Brown bears dominated the entire western half of North America. They were found all the way down into Mexico. And so what happened? Like I said, Europeans don't tolerate being around some of these other apex predators, and they killed them out. So that is what the brown bear population, the brown bear range shrunk to. And so we now have a population of anywhere between 50 to 80,000 in North America. Still pretty strong, but you can see they're confined to that northwesterly portion. All of Alaska, northwest Canada. It does dip down into about 3 or 4 states in that northwest area. Obviously, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Washington are some of the biggest places where we'll find grizzlies, obviously, because they're interior, where we find grizzlies in those lower 48 states. So the range has drastically reduced. So what about this rewilding of brown bears? What's going on here? Well, I don't know the exact year. I think it was in the late 70s. I don't know exactly when, but brown bears or grizzly bears were put on the endangered species list in the lower 48. They were almost completely wiped out. There was only a few hundred left. And so we started protecting grizzlies. And the core area that we started protecting grizzlies was based, the anchor point was Yellowstone National Park. And that was going to be the centerpiece. Now, if you see here on this little map here, that squarish looking figure all the way on the interior, most interior, that is Yellowstone National Park. That's where the core area of brown bears was. That yellow line surrounding it was where we designated the grizzly bear recovery zone. We wanted to recover grizzlies in that area. And over the last couple of decades, we've done wonderfully. All those protections we have on them, the education is a key thing. We're trying to restore brown bears into places that they've long been killed out of. Now, if you look at the green, which is where the brown bears are currently found, you're seeing it's extending way beyond that recovery zone. And so brown bears are definitely rewilding. They're going into places they haven't been in literally hundreds of years. And so this map there is from 2010. Thanks, Melissa, about 1975. This map here is from 2010. At this point in time, they were estimating well over 700 bears, brown bears or grizzlies, had repopulated this grizzly bear recovery area. And this is a map 6 years later. Now, it hasn't changed tremendously, but if you look at the bottom portion, those bears are bursting at the seams. They're spreading out. They're starting to populate different mountain ranges. Those little black dots of bears, this is where they're seeing bears. So brown bears are truly, truly rewilding. They're going into places that they haven't been in well over a few hundred years. And so the cool thing is, this isn't the only place that these brown bears are expanding their territory. And Melissa, who hails from the Pacific Northwest, can talk about some of the issues here. But bears are expanding all throughout Idaho, through Montana, even into that Washington area and the North Cascades. And so they're starting to see more and more brown bears show up where they've been long, long gone. Now, remember what I said early on about how animals repopulate? If it's natural range expansion, people tend not to worry about it as much. Obviously, with a big animal like a brown bear, it could be a scary animal if you're out on your back deck and you see one walk by. But for the most part, if the animals just slowly make their way back into these territories, the public generally accepts it. Now, there have been discussions, and correct me if I'm wrong, Melissa, but there have been talks about whether or not the government was going to come in and reintroduce more grizzlies into the northern Cascades. I don't think that's going to get much traction because, like I said, when it's forced on people, there tends to be a whole lot more pushback. Fortunately, because of this natural range expansion, we should start seeing grizzlies in I shouldn't say much, but in more of their home ranges. I would love to see them go all the way down to New Mexico where I'm at, but I know that probably won't happen in my lifetime. But it's just wonderful to see grizzlies, or these brown bears, starting to make a good comeback in many portions of the lower 48 where they were completely wiped out. All right, let's move on to cougars. Won't spend a ton of time here because, well, no, maybe I will. Not a ton of time, but it depends on where you're joining me on this talk. If you live out west, cougars are like, yeah, we got cougars all over the place. If you live in the east, you'll say, yeah, we got cougars all over the place. You actually don't, and I'll show you why here in a second. But cougar, puma concolor is a scientific name. With the brown bears, I showed you their distribution throughout the northern hemisphere, throughout the entire world. With the cougar, it's a little bit different because they're the most widespread animal in the western hemisphere. So instead of going north-south, we're going east-west. So this red here that you see is the cougar range in the western hemisphere, And you can see it's all of South America and almost all of North America except those more northern climates. However, this range map is what it looked like if you were to land in North America in the 1600s. Cougars were found everywhere, all the way up from Maine to the Baja Peninsula of California and everything in between in North America. The current range is much different. So if you see that, you can see where the cougars currently only reside primarily in the western portion of North America. And I'll go back and do that one more time. And so they've been extirpated, they've been removed, they've been kicked out, they've been killed out from almost all of the eastern half of the United States. Now, population, it's really difficult to get good population numbers on cougars. Very difficult animal to track. The 30,000 animal estimate is rough estimate based in the United States, not including Canada, not including any of the Central America, South America, about 30,000 in the lower 48. And that's based on all the combined population estimates from the western states. Now, the rewilding of cougars, what is going on with this rewilding? And again, if you live in the West, you don't even think of this rewilding because you've always lived with cougars. But cougars have been killed out from most of the eastern half of North America for a couple hundred years. Some of them may have hung on until about 100 years ago, but for the most part, they've been gone for a long, long time. And they were relegated to just being a western species for quite some time. And you see the dark green is where the vast majority of the cougars live nowadays. The central part of the state, that midwestern portion that has the hatch mark, that's where more and more cougars are now moving into, now living. The eastern half is still a good number of years away before we get populations of cougars living there year-round. I shouldn't say, just so you know, the entire East Coast is not devoid of cougars. If you look at this map, there is a small population in the panhandle, not the panhandle, in the far southern portion of Florida, just outside the Everglades. It's typically what we call a Florida panther. It's still a cougar or a mountain lion. It's a little misnomer there, but there is a small population, less than 200 animals down in Florida. But for the most part, they're a western species. Helen, I'll go back to your question as soon as I get through this cougar thing before I go to the wolves. That's a good question, though. So let me wrap up this rewilding of cougars and what's going on. So for the most part, most cougars were killed out from the eastern half of the United States, and they resided in the western half. In fact, a lot of the populations in the West were seriously diminished. But fortunately, with the advent of game agencies, some protections that were afforded them, they started coming back. And so this map here, that dark coloration is the best cougar habitat in all of the United States. All those dots there that you see in the Midwest, those are cougar conformations. They haven't, in a lot of those states, they don't even know if there's breeding cougars. But those dots, since they're showing up more and more and there's more conformations, obviously the populations are growing, or at least starting out in some of those Midwestern states. But you can see a couple of key dots in the east. And so 2011, there was actually a cougar that was killed on the highway in Connecticut. And they're like, what the heck is going on? We don't have cougars here. It was a wild cougar. They did DNA, and it traced back to the Dakotas. And the cool thing, the reason we know this was a wild cougar is all throughout its travels that year, there was trail camera photos, there was scat. They literally tracked it as it moved through the Great Lakes, across the top portion of New York through the Adirondacks, and ended up getting killed in Connecticut when it was struck by that vehicle. Now you do see a couple more dots in that northeast. I will tell you, those are not confirmed wild cougars. Those were confirmed cougars, but oftentimes those cougars were they were declawed. There was no parasites in them, so they were treated medically. And so in most of those dots in that far northeast, those were literally captive animals that were released And so the only wild cougar they know of in that Northeast is that cat that was struck on the highway in 2011. That takes us to my old home state, which was Tennessee. In 2015, a cat showed up in the northeastern or the northwestern portion of the state, and then over the course of about 10 months, it was photographed as it traveled eastward towards the Tennessee River. And you can literally put these dots on a map, and they're in chronological order, so we know it was the same cat that was on the move, and then that cat disappeared. And so there's been no confirmations in over 3 years. So a lot of people, it's funny because I still debate cougars all the time with people in the East. They'll talk about all the cougars that they have there, but there's no pictures. And that Tennessee cat goes to show it is not proof that cougars live in Tennessee. It was actually proof that cougars don't live in Tennessee, because when one single cat showed up, it was photographed 9 times over 10 months. And so a really interesting case there. Both those cats from Connecticut and from Tennessee had DNA that traced back to the Midwest or the Dakotas area, so they know the lineage. So these definitely were Western cats that were moving through. And then the other blip that you see there was a cat that was it was killed along the Alabama-Georgia line, and that cat traced back to the Florida population. So these cats can wander a great distance, and all we need is wandering females that are pregnant to wander a great distance and give birth. But again, here with the cougars, just like the brown bears, what you're seeing, this rewilding of cougars in North America, is natural range expansion. Nobody's bringing them in there, releasing them. They're just coming here on their own. It is definitely more acceptable from the public when these animals come here naturally. So before I go on to wolves, Helen asked a question, is there a population of brown bears in the North Cascades now? Melissa, I was hoping that you could chime in, because there has been brown bears documented in lots of places, and I shouldn't say documented, but reported in lots of places. And until you get confirmations from the game department to verify, the thing is, we cannot accept with any of these large animals, cougars, bears, wolves, we cannot simply take eyewitness accounts as gold, because there's too much possibility of mistaken identity. So the only way that an animal can be documented is if you get a clear picture that cannot be debated of that animal, or if you have DNA or scat. Even a track won't work in most situations, because tracks can become distorted. And so typically the confirmation can only come from that crystal clear photograph or from some type of DNA or scat evidence. Okay, Melissa would know more about the Cascades than I would. There have been reports all along of grizzlies up in the Cascades, but whether or not it's an official documented report, like I said, unless it's verified, eyewitness accounts, yeah, you can have a really knowledgeable person provide that, but even the State Wildlife Agency cannot accept that until it is solid evidence to confirm it. Thanks, Melissa. Catherine asked a question. There are bobcats in North Georgia. Are these the same as cougars? Nope, those are two completely different species. And the one thing that I don't believe most people on the East understand is the sheer size of cougars. So a bobcat typically is only going to weigh between 20, a very, very big bobcat would be about 40 pounds. They could get a little bit bigger, but they're only in that 20 to 40 to 50 pound range. A cougar, on the other hand, can grow up. They'll typically be 100, 120 pounds, 150 pounds. A large male can be as large as 200 pounds. That is a tremendous difference in size. And most I have diagnosed, I have looked at hundreds and hundreds of sightings, and most of them turn out to be bobcats or even house cats from a distance where it's very difficult to gauge size. And so if you see the two up close and personal, you'll definitely see a tremendous difference in size. But when you don't have anything to put that animal in perspective to measure how big it is, it's really, really, really easy to misidentify. The main difference between that bobcat and the cougar, though, is the lack of a long tail on the bobcat. Thank you for Helen mentioned that bobcats have the short tails and a prominent white spots on the back of the ears. That is one thing whenever I'd be sent a trail camera picture to say, ha, I told you we had cougars here. And it would oftentimes be a picture where you couldn't even see the back end because the cat wasn't fully in the picture. But you look at the back of the ears, and if there's prominent white spots, in almost every situation, it's a bobcat. All bobcats have those. Now, every once in a while, you'll have a cougar that might have a little bit light coloring, but it's not as distinct as they are in a bobcat. So that's one of the first things we look at in those photographs. Okay, I'm going to move on to the last apex predator. This is probably one of the funnest and most controversial to talk about. And we're going to talk about gray wolves, Canis lupus. So let's look at the gray wolf range. Now, first and foremost, people oftentimes think, oh my gosh, wolves are endangered. We gotta do something to save wolves. If you thought the brown bear worldwide distribution was pretty crazy and awesome, look at the wolf distribution. They are found everywhere in the northern hemisphere. So North America is a stronghold, and the whole eastern hemisphere, northeastern hemisphere of Asia, even look at Saudi Arabia, you have wolves that literally dominate the whole northern hemisphere. So globally, wolves are not in trouble. We always hear about how imperiled wolves are in the lower 48, and that is definitely something that we're concerned about, but globally, gray wolves are not in trouble. So let's look at that North American distribution, because that's what this talk is about. So when you look to see where wolves are, there's actually some distinct populations that we often talk about. So the first one, when we're looking at North America, and keep your eye on the map, the first population we often talk about is Canada. Canada is a stronghold for gray wolves. Some 60,000 plus wolves in all of Canada. Another big stronghold is Alaska. You got about 10,000 wolves in Alaska. So combined between Canada and Alaska, wolves aren't going anywhere in North America. But then we start talking about the lower 48. And where are the wolves in the lower 48? Because we talk about this lower 48 as being like this unique area that we've got to restore these animals to, and we do in many cases. So what do we have wolf-wise in the lower 48? Well, we have this Great Lakes population, the Western Great Lakes. So there's 3 states there, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. They've got a bunch of wolves, probably anywhere between 3,000 to 4,000 wolves. Now, you don't hear much about the wolves in those states. You want to know why? Because those pretty much came in naturally. Remember I said that the natural range expansion is so much more tolerable? So you don't hear much about those Western Great Lakes wolves. But then we have a population here in the Northern Rockies. We also have a really small population here in the Southwest, the Mexican gray wolf. Again, they're gray wolves. They're just the southern version of the gray wolf. And so if you look at the total population, in North America, they're doing just fine, 70 to 80,000. But if you look at those populations in the West, that greater Yellowstone area, as well as the population of wolves, of those Mexican wolves around the Arizona-New Mexico border, what is distinct or what's special about those populations? They were brought in by man. They were reintroduced. So the government came in, released these wolves to restore the wolf populations. I'm a biologist. I think it's a great thing. But if you hear about controversy with wolves and the reintroduction, you don't hear about controversy with the Western Great Lakes wolf population because they came naturally. The wolves in Yellowstone were brought in 1995? Yeah, 1995. So at the the 25-year anniversary, and the population has done well. It has taken off, and now you have wolves populating Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Washington. So the wolves are doing great. But because that initial population in Yellowstone was brought in, you get a lot more public pushback. And so that's one of the things to consider in this rewilding is if we want some of these animals to return, we've got to be really smart with how we go about it, because if we don't have public buy-in, it's not going to be as successful. Now look at the map again. Look at the big question mark. Why is that area gray? How come there's no wolves there? Well, there's no gray wolves there because if you recall, there were two species of wolves I talk about. There were gray wolves, and then there's these guys. These are red wolves. Red wolves were the dominant wolf species in eastern North America, and they were killed out. We wiped them out. In fact, in I think as late as 1980s, there were no more red wolves in the entire world in the wild. We had red wolves in captivity. It was down to, I don't know the exact number of individuals, but it is less than 100 individuals in the world. And they started, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service started a captive breeding program, and they wanted to reintroduce wolves, red wolves, into the wild. I was actually in Tennessee. I had just moved to Tennessee 1997, and there was a red wolf project in Great Smoky Mountain National Park. They were trying to restore red wolves to the Smokies. Excuse me. Unfortunately, that project didn't work well. The red wolves would reproduce. They'd have a litter, but the pups, they could not raise a successful litter of pups. Each year, the pups kept dying, and for all different reasons. They had parvovirus, they had parasites. There was one year they believe a black bear wiped out the den of wolf pups. And so after 5 or 6 years with no successful reproduction, they abandoned that project, and all the red wolves were collared. They gathered them up, and then they moved them to coastal North Carolina. And today, the only place in the world that we have free-ranging red wolves, and it's sad because there's, I believe, only about 50 or 60 left, are in coastal North Carolina in Alligator National Refuge. So it's not going too well with the red wolves. Hopefully they can hang on. So that was it about the wolves. So we have bears, brown bears, black bears, we have cougars, we have wolves. They're starting to go into areas that they haven't been in a long, long, long time. So all of those species, all those apex predators, the cool, the scary, the stuff that dreams or nightmares are made of, they are expanding their ranges. The good dreams, just all good dreams. So they're expanding their ranges. So this rewilding, the fact that North America is becoming more wild than it was 100, 200 years ago, that's a good thing, isn't it? Well, let's take a look at this because, like I said, even Melissa commented, it can be an oh boy, this is pretty controversial. Because I agree, I will definitely say it's a good thing, but it all depends on who you talk to. So, as with all things, especially all things wildlife, the one thing I always try to stress is you cannot factor man completely out of the equation. Humans are a part of the ecosystem just as well as all other wildlife. So you can't pretend that we don't exist. And the unfortunate thing with these apex predators, whether or not it's the grizzly bears, the wolves, the cougars, we are born into and raised in a society of the big bad wolf. Hopefully that's changing, but understand for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, this is what every child was taught. These animals are bad things. I will say over the last couple of decades, you are definitely seeing a shift in that mentality. There is still a lot of negative thoughts out there for a lot of these apex predators. And so humans in general still have this conflict with some of these wildlife species. And we can't pretend that it doesn't exist. That doesn't help. That doesn't get us anywhere by disregarding what other people think. And so oftentimes you'll hear stories, you'll hear the worst of the worst about how awful these predators are, how they're only out there to kill, they will wipe out other animals. And a lot of that is just pure propaganda from the other side of the argument. But just like I will tell you, just like you hear some of this negative stories about these animals, it's bad. It should not be that biased one way. But just like there's bias to that extreme, there's also bias to the other extreme, where some people will play these animals off as being, oh, they're really, nothing will go wrong. They're really gentle. They won't bother anything. And believe me, that side is equally out there. We're starting to see more and more groups that are painting apex predators in too far of a picture on the other side, saying that they're harmless, they won't cause any issues, and that's not exactly true. The one thing we pride ourselves here at Wildlife for You is providing both sides of the story and providing the science. And so the animals are neither vicious, but they're neither cuddly. They're animals. And so think of what it must be like if you are living in rural America and you are a rancher or you are raising livestock, you're raising animals to feed your family, or not just to feed your family, but to provide the income for your family to survive. And these apex predators move in, and for every livestock, if they take a cow from you, imagine overnight losing $1,000. But understand, a lot of these ranching communities, these ranching families, they are living well below the poverty level. So that $1,000 to you may be more like $10,000 to them. And so it's a real issue. Like I said, I am pretty much always going to side in favor of wildlife, but you have to understand the other side of the equation. It is a big deal for the people that live in those areas that we figure out how to resolve this conflict, because it is real. You just can't dismiss what they see or feel inside regarding some of these animals. And so what are the benefits of apex predators? I'm not going to go into much. If you've been in on my trophic cascades, or I have a couple other webinars that talk about the benefits of having the ecosystem completely intact from a biological standpoint. And Aldo Leopold said it best. It was about intelligent tinkering involves keeping all of the parts. And so apex predators, all different species, doesn't matter if they're carnivores, herbivores, whatever, they all belong in that system to make that system function properly. And so things are usually much more healthy, much more resilient when you have all the species represented. And so if we are able to rewild America, we will have a wild America. And it's one of the most beautiful things you could ever imagine. So with that, I'm going to ask for any questions. Let me see if I talked for an hour. I'm pretty good at that. I will start answering questions while you guys type and while I look over some of these questions. I do want to give photo credits. Bob Howdeshell, Julie Argyle, she's a photographer in the Yellowstone area. She gave me a whole bunch of the wolf photographs, and a huge shout out, thank you to Julie Argyle of the Fish and Wildlife Service. If you like these webinars, mark your calendars. I do have one coming up this Sunday. There was recently another cougar attack on a young boy in California, and so we're redoing a cougar country webinar, but it's going to focus on trail safety. That's this Sunday. Just so you know, that is at a reduced price. I think it's only $8 for the whole class. So if you haven't signed up for that and you want to see a trail safety webinar about cougars, that's this Sunday. But here's one I think many of you will like. We're going to do a brand new webinar in 2 weeks from today. It's titled Spirit Bears, but we're going to be exploring the wide range of coloration in black bears. Black bears are one of my favorite animals, and the fact that they come in almost every color imaginable, I think is something we can spend an hour talking about, looking at pictures and asking questions. So 2 weeks from today, Spirit Bears. I haven't provided any links yet, but follow us on Facebook and you'll be able to sign up for that class. So with that, please, please, please go to the Wildlife for You, not just the webpage, but the Wildlife for You Facebook page, and provide comments. I rely on your comments to inform new people to catch on to these. So by all means, please go there and provide comments. And with that, I'm going to leave it here and just say that is the end, or it could possibly be the beginning, if more and more of these animals end up being in places they once were. So with that, I'm going to put my glasses on. I'll look like Santa Claus for a while, but I will see some of the questions that you guys have typed in. Okay, yeah, I already see a bunch of the comments regarding the farmers and ranchers, and I totally get that. I live in an area where there is quite often, we are at odds with what to do with wildlife, what to do with ranching, because I shouldn't say they're mutually exclusive. You can do both, but there's definitely conflict that results when you have farming and wildlife in the same area. Let's see. Helen made a comment about no cattle on public lands. It's a question mark, so I'm. The thing is, public lands. It is built in. The Forest Service owns quite a bit of public land, and the thing is, the Forest Service is not a wildlife agency. The Forest Service is under the Department of Agriculture, and we are to manage our public lands for sustainable use, but also for multiple resources. And so national forests are meant to manage the lands for wildlife, to manage the lands for timber production, to manage the land for grazing. And so we have to allow grazing where feasible. And there's recreational opportunities, there's cultural opportunities, there's a whole bunch of resources that the Forest Service is mandated to manage for. So we can't just say there's going to be no more grazing. Just like we can't say there's going to be no more wildlife or care for wildlife on these public lands, we can't say there's going to be no more grazing. It's part of the way these national or these public lands have been put together. Trish asks a question, is reintroduction always successful? I mean, it's always predictable. I don't even know if it's always predictable. Prime example, the Red Wolves. That project in the Smokies did not work for a couple of different reasons. For the most part, reintroduction efforts, yes, are usually successful, primarily because there's a lot of work on the front end to try to make sure you have a place to release these animals that's going to be fantastic habitat that will support them, that those animals will thrive on. Another key thing is the source of the animals for reintroduction is really, really important. I'll give you a prime example. '50, 70 years ago, when a lot of states were trying to restore turkeys or trying to restore quail, they were saying, all right, let's just go buy pen-raised turkeys or pen-raised quail. We'll release them into the wild, and then they'll turn wild. That didn't work because domesticated animals, even if they were only raised for a few generations, they lose a lot of wild instincts. And so if you're a quail or a little turkey or a little ground nesting bird, we call them upland game birds, but if you're a bird that survives on the ground, your natural wild instinct is to flee from predators. Doesn't matter if it's a coyote or a hawk, anything that can eat you, you are taking cover and hiding. These domestic birds don't know that. They lived in a barn. They don't recognize what a predator looks like. And so lots of states tried releasing the wrong kind of animals. Those projects never worked. And so the best way to ensure that a reintroduction will work is to get a wild animal from another location and to put that wild animal into this new location because they have the instincts necessary in order to survive. Really good question, Trish. I feel a whole lot better than my boys. My boys are already asleep in their bed. Like I said, I got the flu shot a couple weeks ago, so I think my body is fighting it off. I can feel it, but I think I'll make it out of here okay. Katie Barber mentioned something about keystone species. Katie, I don't know if you saw, but I recently taught a class about keystone species about 2 months ago. All right, lots of thank yous. You are so very well. I so much enjoy giving these talks, so I feel like I should be thanking you instead of you guys thanking me. But I do appreciate it. Oh, Katie mentioned something about elk reintroduction into the Smokies. It was touch and go because the elk had to learn how to hide young. If the wildlife can adapt, equals survival. That's a great point, Katie. In fact, we often talk about that release. I have Kim Delozier, who is the head biologist for the Smokies. We did a webinar about a year and a half ago called Return of the Bugle, and we focused on a lot of those reintroduction efforts. And the thing with the elk and the Smokies, they never realized what an impact that black bear predation would have on the calves. And so I don't know the exact numbers. Kim would remember how many elk were released into the Smokies. But when they were dropping calves, every calf counted. If they wanted that population to grow, they needed as many calves to survive. And what they encountered the first couple of years is a lot of those calves were getting killed by black bears. And so Kim initiated this program for a couple of years that right before the fawning season, they would go in there and trap the bears in Cataloochee and move them out of there. Cataloochee is where they release the elk, but they'd move the bears to the other side of the park. And it would take the bears a number of days, maybe a couple of weeks to get back to Cataloochee, and they would make their way back. But by that time, if the calves had a couple of weeks to grow, they'd be large enough that they could run away from the predation or the black bears. And Kim knew if they had to do that every single year, the program was bound to fail. But they did it for a couple of years. Enough calves survived so the population grew large enough that the predation from the black bears wasn't enough to prevent that population from growing further. Really cool story, but I'm glad you brought that up, Katie. Beth has an awesome comment. Are there other species slated for rewilding? This sounds funny, but I remember seeing a story about beavers being airlifted somewhere by helicopter. You, I, you didn't hear incorrect. Well, you heard incorrectly, but you're super duper duper close. Believe it or not, Beth, beavers were reintroduced into some areas. I believe it was the Pacific Northwest. They were dropped by parachute. And so the boxes were designed that once it landed, they broke open and the beavers repopulated some of the areas. And for the most part, it was successful. I'll just believe that all the parachutes opened because I would hate to think that they didn't. But yeah, it's a crazy story. But there was a beaver restocking that took place by parachute. This wasn't recent. This was decades and decades ago. As far as other animals being reintroduced, we talked about apex predators. They are the charismatic megafauna. People read about this. You see CNN, USA Today, Washington Post. They cover those big stories. So you see lots of stuff about the gray wolves in Yellowstone or grizzlies. But there are reintroductions of animals all over North America, like hellbenders, those big salamanders. Lots of obscure species that I hate to say it, but the public often doesn't care about. Those species are super duper important as well. And so state wildlife agencies are often doing some of these obscure reintroductions. For example, when I was in Tennessee back in the, well, I wasn't there for it, but they released some fishers up into a certain portion of the state. And so there's lots of little critters that don't make the headlines that are still being reintroduced, rewild, so to speak. But today's presentation focused on the ones that you're likely to read about, but it does take place quite often. All right. Any bee introduction? This might be the last question. Katie, bees is a hot topic. You keep hearing about how the American or the native bees, their populations are dwindling. Honeybees are not native for the most part. There's a couple of species, but a lot of them were reintroduced. There's definitely some programs going on where they're trying to bring back some of the native honeybees and reintroduce them. I'm not part of that. That's generally the wildlife I deal with has either fins, fur, or feathers. Now I know bees being an insect generally don't fall in my expertise, but I do know that there are some state agencies, Department of Agriculture, that do deal with some insect reintroduction. Shirley, fantastic point. Bald eagles is one of the greatest success stories. In fact, one of the webinars this year is going to be it's going to be success stories, and we're going to focus on bald eagles and otters. Otters is another huge success story. Yeah, Helen, that's a great point about the mountain goats. It's literally the inverse of what we're talking about here. So some animals, we're trying to restore some of those native animals. We weren't too smart in the beginning. Hindsight is always 20/20, and there were some animals brought into areas that weren't native there, and the mountain goat is a key one. And so you're hearing about these mountain goats that are in areas that are displacing the native bighorn sheep. And the native bighorn sheep are really susceptible to certain diseases like pneumonia, but the native mountain goats are also eating the same foods as the bighorn. And so knowing that those mountain goats are not native, they're trying to remove those from those areas. And so, like I said, it's the inverse of what we talked about tonight, but fascinating field to get into when you're dealing with wildlife, about dealing with ecosystems and what makes a healthy ecosystem, which animals belong, which ones don't. But very good point on that. All right, with that, I believe I hit everyone's questions. I want to thank you again. You guys are awesome. I appreciate the questions, comments, and the thank yous. And like I said, I'm feeling pretty good. I'm more worried about my boys, so I'll be just fine, because I think the flu shot is fending it off, but I can feel the battle raging. So you guys enjoy the night. I think you guys are awesome, and I can't wait for you to join in on future webinars. If you can't make the cougar one, I will post the Spirit Bear link here shortly, so make sure you sign up for that. And with that, I'm going to bid you a very